one of the great controversies that is raging and seems sometimes almost unresolvable, we finally think we've resolved it and we haven't, is a controversy over a piece of land which is now claimed by two nations. That controversy in some way was triggered by the fact that in 1917 the British captured this territory from the Turks. And in 1919 or 1920 there was created this territory called Palestine, which was given as a mandate by the League of Nations to the British. Up until that time, there had been no nation called Palestine. In fact, there had been no territory for a long time called Palestine. Palestine was a word, a kind of informal designation of an area that lay between Syria in the north and Egypt in the south. All right, that was. But in 1919 and 20, it became a formal designation. Its boundaries were determined. In 1922, the British divided up Palestine into two parts. On the East Bank, they created a new country, which they now call Transjordan, which turned into Jordan. And the West Bank retained the name Palestine. Now, the people who lived on that land and the people who came to live on that land entered into a war which began in 1920 and has really been going on for 80 years, still unresolved, with truces and treaties and whatever else it is. The story of one of the people, the Israelis, is fairly well known in the American scene or on the American scene, in the American press and so forth. The story of the Palestinians, the other people, is less well known. Because in a sense, in 1920, a nation, a self-aware nation called Palestinians, did not exist. What existed were people who called themselves Arabs, who lived in the area, and then they discovered they were in a British mandate called Palestine. So the evolution of this nation, of this people, which now has a very, very strong self-awareness, and we're talking about a period of 80 years, right? Over a period of 80 years, the Arabs who lived in this designated area turned into a people called the Palestinians, very strongly self-aware. Well, let me begin with the beginning. The beginning is the place. The setting of Palestine, or Israel, is Western Asia, and Western Asia has what we would call a northwestern sector, which is quite important. It's the piece of land that connects Egypt, which is one of the oldest civilizations, with what today is called Iraq, but used to be called Babylonia or Assyria, another very ancient civilization. It was the piece of land that connected it. And the piece of land that connected it had various names. It was generally called Syria. And you had northern Syria and southern Syria, and what today is called Palestine was called southern Syria. But it was very important. It did not have the wealth of either Egypt or Mesopotamia or Babylonia or what today is called Iraq. But it was in a very, very strategic place. Anybody moving from Egypt north to Mesopotamia had to pass through the land. Anybody moving south to Egypt from Mesopotamia had to pass through the land. The problem with the land, if you've ever been there, is it's mainly a desert. I mean, it's a desert. There's a little thin coastal strip that has some fertility. But on the whole, you're living somewhere in Arizona or New Mexico. And that desert is growing. It's been growing over the last 20,000 years, the desert does not stop growing. If you start from the coast, which is the Mediterranean Sea, you have a thin little coastal plain where you might be able to do some farming, and then you go into the foothills that rise to a very low mountain range, which is like the spine of Palestine. And then you descend very, very deep into a very, very, very deep ravine, if you will. It's called the Rift. It's part of an incredible split that took place hundreds of thousands of years ago. A split that runs all the way from Syria all the way down to Tanzania, cuts through the Red Sea. So you go from the mountain to Death Valley in a matter of just a few miles. Doesn't take you very long. Jerusalem is up on the top of the hill, and then you go down in a few miles, you're in this hot, 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 hot place. And through that rift pours actually a small river. In the dry season, actually, it makes the Rouge River look like a mighty stream. It's called the Jordan. And so that defines pretty much the territory, the coastal plain, the foothills, the mountains, the what? The rift. That's where the scene of the action takes place. Now, into this territory, there poured many people, different people. And you can see why. I mean, it's on a main highway between two major empires. Now, many of the Palestinians today claim that they have a genetic connection to those early people. They're just a continuation of all those people who had lived there before. So let me give you their names. Some of them are familiar to you, some of them may not be familiar to you. The first people that we can identify who arrived in the area are a people called the Canaanites, who were also called the Phoenicians. And they settled down and they established cities and farming areas. In fact, farming was so bad they ultimately turned to commerce, and the Canaanites and the Phoenicians were famous as traders, people of commerce, more than as farmers. The language they spoke is very much like the language that we designate as Hebrew. And then after the Canaanites came another invasion of people very much related to them, speaking almost the same language, called the Amorites. The Canaanites occupied the valleys, the Amorites occupied the hills. And following the Amorites came another people who are the most famous people occupying the land, because the story of their conquest and occupation is to be found in the Bible. In fact, for Jews all over the world, they have just celebrated Pesach or Passover, and that's the story of the Exodus from Egypt, the arrival in a new land, the conquest of that land. Well, if the Canaanites arrived somewhere around 3500 BC, the Hebrews arrived somewhere around 1200 BC. And then we have the story of the Hebrews that went on for over 1,000 years. They established control over this area, and the name they gave to the area wasn't Palestine. There were two Hebrew kingdoms, a northern kingdom called Israel and a southern kingdom called Judah. The northern kingdom is destroyed by the Assyrians. The only one that survives is the southern kingdom of Judah, hence the name Jews. And the capital of that southern kingdom was Jerusalem. The language of this people is a language that we now call Hebrew, but which is called in the Bible Jewish. That's it. And they lived there for a long, long time. And the memory of living there was preserved in their historic records. So even after they left the land or were driven out from the land, they carried with them that story. That story is so famous, it's now read by millions and millions of people all over the world. It's called the Bible, or the part of the Bible which in the Christian world is called the Old Testament, contains the what? The story. So, I mean, a Jewish person could have lived in central Poland, and his ancestors could have lived there for generations. But reading that story, his homeland was this place, the land of Judah, the land of Israel, what other people called Palestine. In fact, the Jews were driven out of the land, but it took a while. Another people arrived into the area. They're very, very important. They're called the Arameans. They spoke a language called Aramaic, and they occupied almost all of northern Western Asia, what today is Syria and Israel and Jordan and Iraq. And their language was used as the chief commercial language, so powerful that Jews stopped speaking Hebrew and started speaking Aramaic as their language. In fact, the alphabet that is now used for Hebrew is an alphabet that came from Aramaic. So now they began to mix. Now you get what you have in Detroit. It's a mixed neighborhood. It started out as a mixed neighborhood. It's very hard not to find a mixed neighborhood in history. You have Canaanites, you have Amorites, you have what? You have Israelites, you have Jews, and now you've got Arameans, and now they're all in this mixed neighborhood. And then, following the Arameans, come a people that is to alter the culture in a very powerful way, because they bring their language and their culture into the area because they believe it is the finest language and the finest culture. They're called the Greeks. And in fact, thousands of people come to live in the place who are Greek, but hundreds of thousands of people who weren't born Greek start speaking Greek, and after a few generations they think they are Greek, and now you've got a whole new element and the whole place changes. Well, by the time you reach the 7th century, CE or AD, by the time you reach that time, the land has undergone many, many changes. It's a changing, mixed neighborhood, like many neighborhoods in Detroit. Got it? The mixture keeps always changing. And when you get to the 7th century, the Jews have almost disappeared. Some of them left because economic opportunity in the land was minimal, and they went to other places. Many of them left because they basically were driven out by foreign conquerors, including the Romans. And in fact, their central shrine in Jerusalem was destroyed. But in the 7th century, which is an important time of change, most of the people living in the place were either Arameans, they spoke this Aramaic, or they were Greek. Those were the two languages. If you went to Jerusalem in the 7th century, you wouldn't hear very much Hebrew anymore. You'd hear Aramaic and Greek. And something else had entered into the land. A religion which began in what we now designate Palestine, called Christianity, had taken over the Roman Empire. And now virtually everybody who had lived in that empire was converted to Christianity. So both the Greeks and the Arameans were now Christians. But it was a land, back in the 7th century, of intense tension. Great tension. So let me mention the tensions, because it isn't that the tensions are new. You can't have a mixed neighborhood without tension. If people keep coming in, new people keep coming in, there's bound to be tension. First of all, the Greeks and the Arameans didn't like each other. The Greeks were often very arrogant about their culture. And so they didn't like the Arameans, and the Arameans resented them. And that was reflected in the fact that they belonged to different Christian groups. The Greeks belonged to a group called Greek Orthodox. And they had their headquarters somewhere in Constantinople. The Arameans, on the other hand, joined branches of Christianity that were hostile to the Orthodox Church. One of them exists very powerfully still in the area. In Lebanon, just north of Palestine, or just north of Israel, there exists a very strong group of people. They're called the Maronites. Sometimes we just call them the Lebanese. They're Christians, and they are of Aramaic origin, and they were for centuries hostile to the Greek Orthodox Church and to the Greek world. So there was that tension which weakened whatever government was in the area. There was the hostility between the Christians and the few remaining Jews that were there. Many Jews still came back to the land, often in pilgrimage. They came back to Jerusalem where the ruins of their ancient temple were to be found. And then there was another tension. There was the tension between those people who lived in the cities and whatever farms there were, and an encroaching enemy. Today we call the encroaching enemy the Bedouin. The Bedouin are the herdsmen who live on the periphery. They don't engage in farming. They raise animals, sheep and goats. It's hard to raise cows because the pasture for cows doesn't really exist. So they have sheep and goats, and they live in tents. You can still see some of them when you go to the area. Now, the Bedouin belonged to a large group of people who were coming up from the south. And they were moving up from the south because the area where they had originally lived was getting drier and drier as this desert was spreading. We call them the Arabs. And they emerged already somewhere around the 2nd century BC. That is, the Arabs did not arrive in the land when the Muslims conquered the land. When the Muslims conquered the land in the 7th century, the Arabs had already been there for some 700 years. They infiltrated the land, the way Bedouin infiltrate. And in fact, there's a very powerful kingdom, an Arab kingdom, that was established in what today in Israel is called the Negev. Negev means the south. In the southern part of Israel, which is a real desert. It's called the Nabatean kingdom. Well, Nabatean was simply another name for Arab. Their great capital is now one of the great tourist destinations of people who go there. It's now possible to visit Jordan, and everybody who goes to Jordan goes to see the grand site at Petra. Oh, Petra. Well, what is Petra? Petra is the capital of an Arab kingdom. It was a powerful Arab kingdom that controlled trade routes leading from the south north. So, when the Muslims arrived in the 7th century, there were already many, many Arabs in the land. And that created another tension, right? Greeks and Arameans didn't like each other. Christians and Jews had tension. The Orthodox and the non-Orthodox were fighting each other. And the farmer people who were Greeks and Arameans didn't like these what? The Arabs who were infiltrating. So this mixed neighborhood had real problems. And then in the 7th century, the Arabs in Arabia were unified by an extraordinary personality named Muhammad, who is the author of a new religion. He claimed he was not the author. He claimed the religion indeed came from Allah, from God, but he was certainly from the historical perspective responsible for the spreading of this religion, which is called Islam, the followers of which are called Muslims. And at the beginning, all Muslims were Arabs. And then, believing that Judgment Day was soon, they had to go out and conquer the world in order to convert all these people so they would have what? A favorable judgment at Judgment Day. So they came out of the desert all fired up with their religion. And in fact, after some absolutely stupendous victories, they took this area. And it became part of the Arab world. Now, at the beginning, this area took on a very important place in the Arab world. First of all, there were not a lot of Arabs. Most of the people for several centuries remained either Greek or Aramean and remained Christian. It took about 3.5 to 4 centuries before most of these people were converted. And one of the major reasons for conversion, obviously, was oppression. Although the Arab Muslims granted Christians and Jews the right to practice their own religion, but with one very severe penalty. It's a penalty that even people today in America pay attention to. If you were Muslim, your taxes were very low. If you were Christian or Jewish, your taxes were very, very high, and you also suffered other civil disabilities. And so people over centuries simply shifted from one side to the other because it simply was easier. Those who were strongly or fanatically attached to their ancestral religion obviously didn't change. That's why many Christians remained in the area. But along the way, what happened was, since Arabic was the official language of the government, people stopped speaking Greek and Aramaic. And pretty soon, everybody was speaking Arabic. It happened to all the immigrants that came to America, right? They stopped speaking their native languages and they were Americanized. They started speaking English. And so pretty soon, it was hard to make a distinction linguistically between those who were natives and those who were Arab intruders or invaders. Everybody now was sort of put together in this Arabic-speaking group. And now even Christians spoke Arabic. So the area was Arabized, and very slowly, very gradually, but the area was very important because the Muslim ruler in the 7th century decided that Medina or Makkah, which were the original centers of Arab power down in the peninsula, were the wrong place. They were too far away from the centers of the empire, which were now in other areas. So they moved the capital to a city right near Palestine. And the name of that city is Damascus. And in fact, if you go to Israel today, or Palestine, whatever, you will find many, many palaces that were built by famous Muslim caliphs because they lived in Damascus, and what? Palestine was the neighborhood. Now, they used the name Palestina for the area. In Arabic, it's hard to say p. When you say p, you say f. No, I mean, but that's, different languages have different sounds that they focus on. So it's Palestina. So there they began to use the name. Where did the name come from? Well, when the Romans wanted to punish the Jews, they revived a name that had been used for a short period of time. The name referred to an ancient people who lived along the coast of Palestine. Their name was the Philistines. And so Palestina is the Latin way of saying the land of the Philistines. And in fact, the Emperor Hadrian deliberately changed the name of the country from Judea to Palestine in order to indicate that the Jews had been defeated and driven out. So the name sort of lingered and was used by the Greeks and the Arameans informally, and then was picked up by the Arabs. And the name was used for the area, the district. It wasn't necessarily a defined area, it was just the area. And it was called Palestine, Palestina, whatever it be. But now almost everybody who lives there speaks Arabic. So somewhere around 850 or 900 AD, the area is an area occupied by Arabic-speaking people. And certainly to outsiders who can't distinguish people from one religion one group and another in terms of their ethnic origins, everybody was simply viewed as what? Arab. Now the area became an area of great turmoil. It just didn't remain stable. It became a continuously changing mixed neighborhood. Let me explain. In the 10th century, there arrived in the country a group of people who came all the way from Algeria and Tunisia. They were of Berber origin. The Berbers had converted to Islam. They also spoke Arabic, and they swept into Egypt, conquered Egypt, created a new capital called Cairo, and then swept into Palestine and took it. They founded a famous dynasty named after the daughter of Muhammad. Her name was Fatima. They're called the Fatimid dynasty. And they established control over the place. In fact, we have a group of people that survived from that era, that emerged in the Fatimid era, of people who worship one of the caliphs of the Fatimids as God. They're called the Druze. You may have heard the name the Druze. They're part of this, they're part of this mixed neighborhood. And then out of the north came the Turks. They swept in, they conquered the whole Eastern Empire. They then conquered Baghdad, which had replaced Damascus as the capital, and they swept into the area. They captured Jerusalem, and they brought Turkish. And in fact, until the 20th century, there were large numbers of Turks living in the area. And then, in order to rescue Jerusalem from the Turks, the Pope in Europe organized an army called the Crusaders. And now thousands and thousands of men, and maybe some attached women, I don't know, French and Germans and Italians, they now pour into the country, and in fact, they capture Palestine. For 100 years, Palestine is called the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And they bring their genes into the place. You can see Crusader genes all over the area. There are blonde people with blue eyes. You spot them. I mean, genes are very interesting. Once they come into a mixed neighborhood, they tend to stay. So you don't have any uniformity. I mean, this neighborhood, things are pouring in all the time. And in fact, while most people still speak Arabic, certainly in the 11th or 12th century, you'd hear a lot of Turkish, and you'd hear a lot of French, or the beginnings of what today we call French, because the French had come with the Crusaders, so it's all mixed up. And then the Crusaders are driven out by another group of people called the Mamelukes. And the Mamelukes, I mentioned them when I discussed the Chechens. The Mamelukes are people that come from the Caucasus, and they took over Egypt, and now they took over Palestine, and they brought a whole new group of genes with them. All right. You're getting a sense of this mix now? Just keep throwing something in all the time. It's no different from what today we call America now, except our changes are not by war invasion, but rather, hopefully, by peaceful immigration. Stability was not restored to the area until the 16th century. In the 16th century, a band of Turks called the Ottomans, named after their ruling dynasty, who had captured Constantinople and changed its name to Istanbul, now created a new empire. And in the 16th century, they arrived in the land and took it over. When they arrived in the land, it was a mixed neighborhood, and the Ottomans initially improved the area. They divided up the area into provinces. No province was called Palestine. There was a province called Jerusalem. There was a province called Akko. Akko is a city just north of Haifa in Israel. It's another little province. The area was informally called Palestine. Most of the people living in it were certainly Arabs, but there were lots of Turks, and there were Jews, and there were other people who were living in the area. And they rebuilt Jerusalem, the great symbol in the land of the Ottoman presence, are the walls of Jerusalem. Many people look at those walls, they think they're walls left over from ancient times. Wrong. They were built by the Ottomans, who paid for them. Do you understand what it is to put up that kind of a wall around a city? How much money? Money is required. They put the wall up around the city, but no sooner did they finish it than something happened that was to affect the land. The land was, to begin with, a desert. You would need a very vigorous, enterprising people engaged in trade and commerce to keep this place what? Moving. I mean, it's like Arizona. If Arizona was hit by an economic depression and no more tourists came, what? What? In order to survive in a desert, you got to have what? You got to have energy to keep it going. So the same was true here. The economic system of the Ottoman Empire collapsed because Western Europe now took over world trade. They changed the whole nature of trade routes by turning to the oceans and seas and no longer using the route through the Ottoman Empire to India and China. And as a result, the economy collapsed. And in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, Palestine turned into an economic dump. In fact, it got so bad, the population shrank. It was either consumed by departure or disease. And then it was infiltrated by Bedouin, Arab Bedouin who came out of the desert and now moved into the area. It was a ruin. And in fact, the population of Palestine at the end of the 19th century most likely was 1/4 of what it was at the time when the Muslims conquered the land. It shrank because we only have to look at Detroit. When the economy what? Collapses, neighborhoods empty out. So we have the same kind of experience. Now, the people who remained there were, on the whole, people we would describe as Arabs, but they didn't use the word that much, and let me explain why. Although they spoke Arabic, they used other words to describe themselves. When the Turks, the Ottoman Turks, established their control over the area, they decided to create a system of identification which still survives to a large degree in the area. They said that people should be identified not by race or ethnicity or language. People should be classified by religion. And in fact, the Ottomans forbade any member of one religion to marry any member of what? Another religion other than Muslims. Muslims could marry other people so long as they converted to Islam. Otherwise, close shop. So now you had a big classification called Sunni Muslim, the largest denomination of Muslims. That included both Turks and Arabs. So if you asked a Sunni Turk, what are you? He would say, I'm a Sunni. If you asked a Sunni Arab, what are you? He would say what? I'm a Sunni. We belong to the same religious group. And then they had something for Shiites, and then they had something for the Christians, and they were divided up into Greek Orthodox Christians and not Greek Orthodox Christians. And then they had one for the Jews. Now the name of each of these groups was a millet. Millet. And every millet had its head, a patriarch, a chief rabbi, whatever else it is. And the rule was very clear. You could not marry outside your religion. Well, if you do that over a period of generations, your religion turns into an ethnic group. It turns into a gene pool, doesn't it? You can only marry what? Within the framework. So religion and ethnicity now begin to merge. And that's indeed what happened. The word Arab was never used, nor the word Turk. The Turks chose this very wisely. They were a minority in their own empire. If they classified people according to ethnicity, they would have been a what? A minority. Since they were Sunni Muslims and so were most Arabs, they now created this what? This huge group called the Sunni group, and that was it. So in Palestine, there were no Palestinians, and there were very few people who went around saying, I am an Arab. They identified themselves by their religion. If you were Christian, Greek Orthodox, that's what you called yourself. And you only married other Christian, Greek Orthodox people. It wasn't America. And then into the whole thing arrive the Europeans. It's the 19th century. The Ottoman Empire is a dump. It's falling apart. The place that's getting rich is Western Europe and North America and the whole thing. And now the people who arrive are the English and the French. And when they arrive, although they are Christian, they're really in the post-Christian age. The post-Christian age means, yes, we're Christian, and we certainly respect being Christian, but we have another agenda. That agenda is business. It is now the age of capitalism, and the people who arrive are not necessarily interested in converting the natives to Christianity, although some missionaries do arrive. So now the Europeans arrive. The first European to really arrive in the area was a general by the name of Napoleon, who was defeated. But in the end, the European powers entered the area because the Ottoman Empire needed the help of the British and French to keep the Russians out. So now there enters a change. The Ottoman Empire cannot keep out the technology or the ideas coming from Western Europe. So slowly but surely what happens is they pick up ideas. How to build a road. How to organize a government department. And how to establish a school. One of the things Europeans did in this place, and it influenced the story of the Palestinians very much, was to establish schools. The schools were initially established, in many cases, by Christian missionaries who realized it was a waste of time. So they simply turned either to providing hospitals, medicine, or providing education. One of the most famous of these institutions, just north of Palestine, which was to influence the whole nature of what I call the story of the Palestinians, in what today is Lebanon, is the city of Beirut. And in Beirut, they founded one of the major institutions of Arab nationalism. Without it, most likely, Arab nationalism wouldn't have gotten the start it did. It's called the American University. Very famous. If you ever get to Lebanon and Beirut, it's in West Beirut, sorry, go visit. I visited the campus. I spoke to the faculty because I realized how important this institution was. The people who came, in many cases, were Presbyterians, Methodists, who knows what. And they came to start a school, and they realized they weren't going to convert the natives, so they wanted to give them a modern education. A modern education means not training in the Bible or the Quran. It means the kind of secular education that we talk about. And along the way, they brought an idea which came from Western Europe. It's called nationalism. In France, they had discovered, in the French Revolution, the way to identify people is not to identify them as Catholics or Protestants or Jews. The way to identify them is to identify them as what? French. All those people who are committed to the French language and French culture are what? French. So now they had a lot of Christian students. The problem with the Christian students was they were a minority in this world. But the teacher said to them, you're not a minority. You and the Muslims belong to one people, just like the French, right? You are Christian Arabs. They are what? Muslim Arabs. You belong to the same people because you speak the what? The same language. And out of it, there arose, in the 19th century, a very powerful idea that swept throughout the area. It's called Arab nationalism. No. Yes, I am Muslim, but more important is the fact that I'm what? That I'm Arab. Yes, I am Christian, but more important than I'm Christian, than the fact that I'm Christian is that I'm what? That I'm Arab. And now here is a uniting force between Muslims and Christians. Even Jews could do the same thing. If I was an Arabic-speaking Jew, I was an Arab. And the idea swept through the area because it was very clear. The government of the Turks was dreadful. We all remember Jose Ferrar in Lawrence of Arabia. Do you remember him? It was a terrible government. And now the force that was going to sweep the Turks out of the area was the new force of Arab nationalism, which would no longer be tied to religion. In fact, it would be tied to some of these new ideas coming from Western Europe that would give the people a whole new power. So in Palestine, many Christians and Muslims who were educated were caught up in what I call Arab nationalism. And in 1914, these Arab nationalists, notice the word Palestinian is not, have I used it yet? No. These Arab nationalists now see a chance to drive out the Turks. The British and the French are on one side. The Turks are on the other with the Germans. And so now Lawrence of Arabia shows up. And Lawrence of Arabia now arranges an alliance between Arab leaders, not in Palestine. They live all the way down here in Arabia, what today is called Saudi Arabia. And what they promise is the following. If you can mobilize the Arab people in Palestine, in Syria, in Iraq, wherever it is, to join us and drive out the Turks, we will reward you with an Arab nation. A nation that includes Muslims and Christians and, whatever, everybody. And in fact, the Arab leadership bought it. And they fought, many of them, on the side of the British. In fact, at the end of the war, an Arab army had passed through Palestine and had reached Damascus. And a man by the name of Faisal, who was the son of the king of Mecca, had already proclaimed himself the king of the Arabs, which was to include Palestine. But then came, in Arab eyes, was the Great Betrayal. And the Great Betrayal featured two things which are part of the mentality, certainly, of any Palestinian. The first betrayal was that while they were talking to the Arabs, the British were also talking to the French. And in 1915, they signed a secret treaty called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, in which they divided up all the territory they were going to give to the Arab nation. They were going to end up as British and French possessions. Oh. The French got Lebanon and Syria. The British got what today is called Palestine, and that's why they formally created this territory in 1919, 1920. Betrayal. Faisal was driven out from Damascus. And the second was in 1917. And one is never very clear about the motivation. One of the presumptions is that the British were seeking to win the support of the world Jewish community for the British and French cause in a war where most Jews in the world disliked the Russian government for its anti-Semitic policies and therefore favored Germany. And to win their favor, there was issued in November of 1917 the famous Balfour Declaration, which promised the Jews Palestine as a Jewish national homeland. Well, from the point of view of the Arabs, this was a what? It was, in their mind, a betrayal. And they were not into the agenda of Jews in Europe who were suffering an intense anti-Semitism and were responding to it and were seeking to find an alternative place, all they knew is that what? What they had imagined would come into existence, what they felt had been promised, was not available to them, and now the British arrive in Palestine. And by the way, the British did a lot in Palestine. Generally, if you read Israeli literature where there's great hostility to the British, you don't get much credit given to the British. But the British set up the administration. They built roads, they set up an administration, they set up departments, they built ports, they cleared swamp, they did a lot of things. And now they're there. The official language now of Palestine, you know what it is. English. We'd all have a good time. I mean, now it was English, and obviously subsidiary languages were the language of the Zionist movement, which was Hebrew and Arabic. And from the beginning, there was provocation. So let me just talk about the provocation from the point of view of the Arabs. They're not yet called Palestinians, right? The Arabs who reside in a British territory called Palestine. Well, first, the High Commissioner chosen by the British to govern Palestine, in accordance with the Balfour Declaration, was a distinguished British Jew by the name of Herbert Samuel. So he now arrives. Now, certainly from the Jewish point of view, they thought that was wonderful. From the Arab point of view, that was what? A major, major provocation. Herbert Samuel is one of those people responsible for the creation of one of the great educational institutions of the area, the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. It's all part of that. The second provocation was the arrival of first dozens and then hundreds of Jewish settlers from Europe. So now let me try to describe a contrast. The Arab world had had Jews in its midst for a long time. They could basically be called Eastern or Oriental Jews. Most of them would be Oriental. Some of them were Sephardic because their ancestors had come from Spain. And in fact, their lifestyle pretty much conformed to the lifestyle of the Middle East. But the Jewish people who now arrived looked like Europeans. And in fact, they had a European lifestyle and European attitudes. Most of them were not even religious, which in this religious world was what? A provocation. Many of them were radicals. That's why they had joined the Zionist movement. Many of the radicals were women who now believed in what? Female liberation, men and women working. So you now have a group of people arriving in this area who are culturally, do you understand? I mean, Oriental Jews fit into the what? Into the picture. But these Ashkenazic Jews from Europe didn't. So the provocation of all these arrivals, and now these settlers are arriving, and they're acquiring land. How are they acquiring land? Well, very simple. The Jews bought the land. Whom do they buy it from? Well, most of the land was owned by Arab landowners who didn't work the land. They lived in Jaffa or maybe in Damascus or someplace else, or Cairo. And the people who worked the land didn't own it. So if the Jewish National Fund wanted to contact the landowner, a legitimate transaction took place, right? What do you want? There was money, do you understand? So the land was sold. Now, if I'm the Arab worker on the land, I suddenly discover that the land has been sold. And now the settlers arrive, and they have a legitimate document, right? The land is sold, and now the Arab peasants have to move off of it, and the what? The settlers now move it. In many cases, land was acquired that had been abandoned. But now the settlers arrive in the area and they develop it. They bring with it Western techniques. And all of a sudden, this dynamic culture now moves in. In fact, a suburb of an old Arab city called Jaffa now turns into a city bigger than Jaffa. Like Oakland County and Detroit. Oakland County now has more people than Detroit. It's called Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv was just a little suburb. The Zionists who came to Jaffa said, we can't stand it. There's no plumbing. There's nothing. I mean, we just can't stay here. So they went out and they did this little suburb. And the suburb turned into this incredible city, which is now not an Eastern, Middle Eastern city. Tel Aviv, almost from the very beginning, was what? It was a Western city built by Europeans. And now now this mixed neighborhood is changing. In fact, the arrival of the Zionists in the 20th century is like the arrival of the Greeks in the 4th century with an entirely new kind of culture. And what it produces, obviously, is a new environment. The new environment is one in which many of the Arabs themselves are seduced to the Western culture. They like it. They like the prosperity, whatever else it is. And one of the interesting things that happen is that thousands and thousands of Arabs living in other places immigrate to Palestine because there is now what? Economic opportunity because of the new investment. So the mixed neighborhood now gets a little more crowded. The population is growing. Well, the Arabs in Palestine had a choice. The choice, obviously, one choice was, and the British would have really enjoyed it, that the Arabs and Jews would have simply shared the place, and the British would have remained as managers. They liked that. Little country club, a little office building over here. They enjoy that role. They're pretty good at that. But that was not to be, because not only was there Jewish nationalism, which said, no, we want an independent Jewish state. There was Arab nationalism now that said, no, we want an independent Arab state, not just Palestine, but the whole what? The Arab world all united into one great state. So the resistance movement started, and in fact, the beginning of what we would call Palestinian nationalism is somewhere around 1920. Because in 1920, there were several painful confrontations between Jewish settlers and the Arabs who were there. In 1925, Jews were killed, and as a result, Jewish Defense Force was now set up in response to it, and the war had begun. Now, between 1920 and 1948, that's 28 years, the war went through various phases. Between 1920 and 1929, it was pretty much a soft one. One of the problems of the Palestinian Arabs was finding a leader. You need a leader. The Zionists ultimately found a leader. They had a series of leaders, but the man who emerged as their leader toward the end of the 1920s, the early 1930s, was a very, very dynamic, determined person, a radical who had come out of Eastern Europe. His name was David ben Gurion, so you have that figure. But the Arabs didn't have a leader, and in fact, they found a leader who wasn't exactly the right one. See, if you're going to be an Arab nationalist leader, you better not be a Christian priest or a Muslim imam or something like that, because that would divide. Huh? The man they found as their leader was the chief judge of the Muslims in Palestine. He had a title. His name was the Mufti. And he belonged to a very distinguished old Palestinian Arab family called the Husseinis. The Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts, okay. In Palestinian society, they were great landowners. Were the Husseinis and the Nashashibis. Those are the two families. And he belonged to the Husseinis. And he, the Mufti, got this job because he belonged to this family. He was very interesting. He was tall, very fair, and had blue eyes. There's a lot of Crusader genes floating around this community. And Husseini, the Mufti, now became the leader which now alienated to some degree the Christian Arabs, right, because it was a Muslim leader, and it also alienated to some degree some of the more secular people in the community, but there he was. In 1929, things were aggravated by the final establishment of a representative body for the Jewish community. The Arabs refused to establish their own because they refused to concede that there should be two representative bodies, Jewish and Arab. So it's called the Jewish Agency, which was part of the World Zionist Organization. And then in 1933, it really got going. Because in 1933, there arrived in Palestine thousands and thousands of refugees from Germany and from Europe. And that was the trigger. By 1936, something called the Arab High Committee was established, which was a resistance movement. It was headed by the Mufti, and open rebellion broke out. The British now found themselves with an active rebellion. They had to put down the Arab rebellion, which they did, with the help of Jewish settlers. Now, that rebellion triggered a very, very intense hatred of the opposition. But now the British are worried. Hitler's rising to power, and Palestine is very vulnerable. So they get a few committees going to research. There's the Simpson Committee, there's the MacDonald Committee, there's the Peel Committee. And ultimately, there is the committee that produces the white paper. And the British reversed their position. Where initially they had started out as favoring the Jewish community, they now end up favoring the Arab community, because they say, look, we got to fight Hitler. I mean, there's the war. If we don't do something now, we'll have the whole Arab world against us, because Palestine is only part of the Arab world. Give us a break. So they placed restrictions on Jewish immigration, but for the Mufti, that didn't make any difference. If I were a Palestinian leader in 1939, and I didn't trust the British, there was an avenue for me to go to. It's called Berlin. In fact, the Mufti established an alliance with Nazi Germany. It was logical. I mean, otherwise, the British would win, and what, you would never get rid of the British, and they didn't really trust the British. Well, in the end, that was a fatal mistake, because we all know the end of the story. By the way, in 1940, it was not unintelligent to assume the Germans would win the war. Do you understand? France fell, the whole thing. Only we in America are going to think, the British are going to, but an intelligent person could say that the other side could win. And in fact, the Germans promised independence. It was a tragic mistake. In the end, the Germans were defeated, and along the way, did something that would make the position of the Palestinian Arabs impossible. They killed 6 million innocent Jews. Now, what that meant was that the Jewish world is now what? Mobilized like never before. All of a sudden, Zionism sweeps the whole Jewish community. We've got to find a place for all the refugees. Whoever is left, they can't go back to where they were. They were massacred, their families. And now there is some sense of guilt on the part of the world that stood by and allowed it to happen. So, 1948 arrives. The Arab High Committee has basically disbanded. The Mufti now is a refugee. There's no leadership. And now, in 1948, the British say, we're leaving. But the only people who were organized in any reasonable way were the Zionists. They were only 600,000 out of a total population of 1,800,000, but they were better organized. And the Palestinian Arabs were supported by their Arab brothers, who were in a state of massive disorganization too, because many of them were just newly independent countries. They had no infrastructure to support the war. In the end, the Arabs are defeated. And what follows is the great humiliation. Well, the great humiliation is that thousands and thousands and thousands of refugees, Palestinian Arab refugees, now pour out of Palestine. They go to neighboring countries. They go to Lebanon. They go to Jordan. They go to Egypt. They go to Syria. And something now happens which is to be one of the sources of Palestinian nationalism. See, if I'm an Arab from Palestine and I go to Syria and it's an Arab country, why can't I just be absorbed into a what? An Arab country. In fact, many Zionists use that as an argument. Well, they're just going to look at this big Arab world. They can all be absorbed. But what happened when they arrived in these places was they were put into camps. And the reason was very clear. The economies of all these Arab countries were very fragile. They had no jobs for these people. They didn't want them. So they put them into camps, and in fact, the ideology that put them into the camp said, we're putting you into the camp because you're only here temporarily. Very soon, Arab armies will what? Will sweep into Israel, and you'll go back. So now you've got, although they're living in Syria or Lebanon or Jordan, whatever it is, they're in a place where they're made to feel intensely different. They're not Syrians, they're not Jordanians, they're not Lebanese. They are what? They have to define themselves now. They're Palestinians. Even the other Arabs in their neighborhood now call them the what? The Palestinians. In addition, somewhere around 250,000 Palestinian Arabs find themselves to be members of Israel. Oh. Their birth rate is high and it's going to grow, so you have to understand. They're now theoretically Israelis. But the Jewish establishment doesn't trust them. So from the very beginning, they get a kind of second-class citizenship, which only reinforces their what? Their identity. I mean, the sign of it is when money is distributed for education or welfare, the Jewish community is favored, and the reason for that is the money will go to those people who fight for the nation. Well, the Palestinian Arabs are not drafted to fight for the nation because there's a great fear that if you draft Palestinian Arabs into an Israeli army, they will what? They will side with the enemy. So therefore, they're not entitled to the privileges that go with veterans. Oh. Well, therefore, what ultimately happens is the Palestinian Arabs invest themselves in a new idea. A great leader arises in Egypt. His name is Gamal Abdel Nasser. And he says, forget about Palestinians, forget about Lebanese, forget about Syrians, forget about Egyptians. We are all what? Arabs, and what we want to do is to create an Arab nation from Morocco to Iran. And he sweeps them all up into this Arab nationalism. And then comes the most humiliating moment. I mean, it is. It's June of 1967. Some people in this room may remember. In June of 1967, Gamal Abdel Nasser is prepared now. It's the great Arab dream of creating the what? The great Arab state is now prepared to crush Israel, but Israel preempts it and bombs the Egyptians. And when the Jordanians and the Syrians insist on joining Nasser, in turn, they enter into the war only to be defeated. I mean, it was Israel's most triumphant moment. Gamal Abdel Nasser is defeated. Ultimately, he goes into a deep depression and he dies. And what dies with it, very important, what dies with it is the first movement that swept the Arabs of Palestine is called Arab nationalism. It's very clear in 1967 there will be nobody around that will be able to unify the Arab world. So now the Palestinian Arabs are on their own. And I'm going to give you a year. 1967 is the crucial year in the development of what I call Palestinian nationalism. And if you want to hear the rest of the story, come back in a few minutes. Thank you. Now, until 1967, the basic nationalism of the Arabs in Israel, Palestine, whatever it be, was Arab nationalism. It was the idea of uniting all the Arab people, some 120 million of them, stretching from Morocco to Iraq, into one nation. And the person who represented that dream was Nasser. So you can't speak of Palestinian nationalism in Israel or Jordan or Lebanon, whatever, because everybody was caught up in Arab nationalism. But 1967 changed the whole picture, because it was clear that the dream of a united Arab state was not possible to be realized. And an enormous disillusionment set in the Arab world. It was also clear that the Palestinian Arabs had placed their hopes in the wrong place. And now, the only alternative they had was to organize their own resistance, because there wasn't going to be anybody out there to organize it for them. That is, all the other Arab states used the Palestinian issue as a way of mobilizing their own people to support their government. But they weren't prepared to do anything. So either they could accept their humiliating lot, or they could offer resistance. And the only kind of resistance would have to be based not on Arab nationalism, but on a Palestinian nationalism. And it's after 1967 that the word Palestinian now comes into use. In fact, the Palestinian nationalists now developed a kind of reverse Zionism. They had hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people living outside of Palestine or Israel. And they were refugees, and they now wanted to come home. So what is ironic is that Palestinian propaganda after 1967 sounded a lot like Zionist propaganda. Zionist propaganda talked about Jews going what? Going home. So now the Palestinians are now talking about going home. And in fact, the intensity of their feeling. And that was reinforced by the fact they had experienced so much rejection in the Arab world. that they saw and felt themselves as Palestinians. And living in Syria was not going home because the Syrians weren't nice to them. And living in Lebanon wasn't going home because the Lebanese were what? Not nice to them. Nor were the Egyptians. Obviously, thousands of them, in order to survive, assimilated into their environments. The ones that did it most easily were the educated because they found jobs. And they became Iraqis and Egyptians and Syrians and Lebanese. But for the overwhelming majority, that was not the case. The discrimination they found in the Arab world only reinforced their sense of being Palestinian. So the setting in 1967 of what I call the real development of Palestinian nationalism is an all-powerful Israeli military. You may remember how the world felt about the Israeli military in 1967 and 1973. I mean, they brought Moshe Dayan to Washington to consult what should they do in the Vietnam War. All right. The setting was the Cold War between America on one side and the Soviet Union on the other, and the communists on the other. The setting was the rejection that the Palestinians felt in so many parts of the Arab world. One of the things was the growing popularity of Marxism. Now, Marx had said that Marxism would only be understood by people in an advanced industrial culture. I mean, the tragedy of Marxism, maybe, or the irony of Marxism, is that it spread most easily in countries that were not advanced industrial countries at all. I mean, Marx said you need an advanced proletariat, urban proletariat to conduct the revolution. So now we got Russia, and we got what? We got China, right? And we got the Middle East. One of the reasons why Marxism was so popular everywhere it went was that it was anti-Western and anti-American. Whether people understood Marx, understanding Marx is not easy, by the way. I'll give you Das Kapital and you tell me what it means. All right. Not easy. But one of the themes of Marxism, it's the reason why it took over China, it was anti-foreigner. And the one thing these people wanted to get rid of were what? The foreigners. So there was a very strong Marxist presence in a world which couldn't really understand the basic tenets of Marxism because its major propaganda item was kick out the what? The foreigners. The Israelis are now identified with the Americans who support the Israelis, right? So it's anti-American, kick out the foreigners. The setting is a world in which Arab nationalists and Palestinian nationalists are divided into two groups. There are those who still remain very religious, but many Palestinians are no longer religious. They have been deeply influenced by Western culture. And now they've entered into what we call the secular phase. In fact, they believe that the religious leaders are responsible for the disaster because they encourage a certain kind of resignation, passivity, or irrational fanaticism. And there's a tension there. But the main setting is that after 1967, over half the Palestinian world is now in Israeli hands because the Israelis have taken the West Bank and Gaza. The 250,000 Palestinians that started out in 1948 have now turned into 800,000, called birth rate. And so you have close to 1 million in old Israel, and now you've got 1.5 million or more in the West Bank and Gaza, and in 1967 there may have been about 5 million Palestinians around the world. Half of them are now in Israeli hands, and now Israel has to digest these people. In 1948, they were freed of the problem because the people what? Fled from their territory. Now they've got them. It's as though Oakland County annexed Detroit. Oh. That creates the whole what? new situation. Okay. So now, in this setting, the Palestinians are trying to organize themselves by themselves. They can't rely on Nasser, gone. Now it's Palestinian nationalism. Well, you put two Palestinians in one room, it's like most people. They get what? 3 parties. Okay. So let me give you the major parties. The largest Palestinian faction, which was slightly to the left, was called Fatah. And the leader of that was a relative of the Mufti, who belonged to a very prestigious family, the Husseini family. Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, Cabots, and lodges of the Palestinians. His name was Yasser Arafat. And he had gone down to study after the debacle in 1948. He had gone down to study in Egypt. And it was, in fact, in Egypt under Nasser that attempts were made to mobilize the Palestinians for Arab nationalism, and he was part of that. But now Nasser was what? Gone, so he reappears, the leader of the Fatah faction. Now there is one farther to the left called the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, led by a Christian Palestinian by the name of George Habash. And they're a little bit into the Marxist revolution, but basically it's all anti-Western, anti-American, get rid of the foreigners, whatever. And then a little to the left of him is the Popular Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Answering the telephone, you don't know what organization is answering. After a while, there's so many. His name is Khawatmeh. And then there's a break-off faction from the Fatah led by a man called Jibril. And then there are the communists. They all ultimately all get together into a single organization, which is like a national liberation army, called the Palestine Liberation Organization, called the PLO, which emerges about the same time as the defeat of Nasser in 1967. That's the trigger for the emergence now of the PLO, and attached to the PLO is the PLA, the Palestine Liberation Army, and the leader of it all, because he's the leader of the dominant faction, is Yasser Arafat. And now the word Palestinian. Now you're getting not just the word Arab, you're getting the word what? Getting the word Palestinian. Now there emerges this idea of a Palestinian identity. Well, the PLO had to come up with a strategy. I mean, the goal is clear. The goal is to drive the Jews from Israel. All right, got the goal. And here you've got one of the most powerful armies in the world, despite the size of the state, all right? Proven by the victory in 1967. How are they going to do it? Well, they say, we're at war. And even though it may take years and years and years and years and years, we're at what? We're at war. Second strategy. We have to establish bases for our army. Well, we can't establish bases in Israeli territory. So we have to establish bases outside. The first base that they established for their liberation army was Jordan. Jordan had owned the West Bank between 48 and 67, was driven across the Jordan River, and now in Jordan, which was sort of scared of the Israeli military, the PLO establishes its main base, and the reason it can do that is over 1/2 of the people who live in Jordan are Palestinian refugees. One of the strategies, obviously, is propaganda, and that's revved up throughout all Palestinian communities. The idea is now that there is a Palestinian identity and that there is a fierce enemy supported by the United States of America, because 1967 convinced the United States government of the value of the alliance between Israel and the United States. Now, one of the major strategies was, if America's our enemy, then Russia's our friend. So off to Moscow goes Yasser. And they make what? A deal. It's the rational thing to do. They're not going to get any help from the Americans, so they get help now from the Russians, from the Soviet Union, as do many other anti-American Arab and Muslim states. One of the strategies is to attract attention the key thing in the world today is called public relations. Public relations means, how do I make myself visible? How do I let people know I'm around? I mean, most people in Dubuque, Iowa, did they know about the Palestinians? I mean, they only know about the high school basketball. I mean, what do they know? I mean, they know French, German, Russian. Where do they get Palestinian? The only way you can make your mark is to do something so dramatic that the world what? Wakes up to your tragedy, to your issue. And that's the purpose of terrorism. The purpose of terrorism is a form of public relations. It's a way of saying, here we are, you better pay attention. So, in fact, the world did wake up, right? By the early 1970s, after Munich and who knows what, in airports, people were certainly aware that what Palestinians were around. It was a successful, initially successful public relations campaign. And one of the strategies was, if the PLO is an army, it's got to be run by a commander-in-chief. And from the very beginning, there was almost no democracy. Yasser Arafat appeared as a kind of authoritarian dictator rule, and the justification was very clear. We have no time for democratic procedures. We are fighting a war, and when we're fighting a war, that's what we have to do. One of the ways to increase visibility was to go to the United Nations. And in the United Nations, there are now many, many new nations from Africa and Asia who would be sympathetic to the plight of the Palestinians. And the net result, of course, was a huge success for Arafat, even though the Palestinians weren't a member of the United Nations, in which Zionism was condemned as racism, which infuriated the state of Israel and the world Jewish community and many people in the United States of America. The next thing was to turn to the third world. Many countries in the third world established diplomatic relations with the PLO, although the PLO didn't have a territory, and broke off diplomatic relations with the state of Israel. And then in the 1970s, after the radicalization of politics in the 60s because of the Vietnam War, the PLO now appealed to many radicals in Europe and in North America who felt that oppressed peoples needed to be recognized, and that now changed the attitudes in some cases of the left. The left after World War II was uniformly in favor of the state of Israel. But after 1967, elements of the left now what? Began to change. And now you find on the left hostility to the state of Israel, which made the Israelis very uncomfortable. They'd always been used to being on the sort of on the left, and now they find themselves coddled by the conservatives. But this whole strategy failed. First of all, the ally of Israel was the United States of America, a winning country. The ally of the PLO were the Russians. If you want to curse somebody, do you understand? You give them the Russians as their ally. They were all promises, meetings in Moscow and the whole thing, and nothing. I mean, there were military weapons given, but in the end, the kind of support system that was required, the Russians couldn't provide because the Israelis were attached to a triumphant power, and the PLO was attached to a power that was beginning to feel its own weakness. One of the reasons it failed was that world public opinion turned partially against the Palestinians because of terrorism. After a while, people, even who were slightly sympathetic, were pretty annoyed about being afraid to go to the airport. The terrorism itself, blowing up children, blowing up, innocent people, I mean, in the end, it was counterproductive. It created one benefit. The first benefit was what? It brought the Palestinians to the attention of the world. On the other hand, it was counterproductive. One of the reasons it failed was Arab hostility. Let's take Mr. Assad, the ruler of Syria. Well, let's say he doesn't want to give anything to the PLO. But why would he be hostile to the PLO? Oh, the reason is fairly clear. Mr. Assad would like to expand Syria. He'd like to include Lebanon and Jordan and Palestine. If the PLO is successful, his ambitions will be frustrated. So his propaganda machine says, oh, the PLO, wonderful, 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 but behind their back he's what? And in fact, Arafat found that time after time. He was always complaining about betrayal because other Arab leaders didn't want a Palestinian state to really emerge. Why would the king of Jordan want a Palestinian state? If anything, he'd want to re-annex the West Bank. Why does he want Arafat to have his Palestinian state? So although the propaganda was nice, the behavior was often very different. One of the reasons it failed was there now arose in the Arab world a major division. The success of Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran raised the fortunes of Muslim fundamentalism. And now there emerged in the Palestinian world fundamentalist forces. And these fundamentalist forces were hostile not only to the Israelis or the Americans, they were also hostile to other Palestinians who were not fundamentalist. Oh. It's very much like the division in Israel between the secular and the religious. The same division exists in the Palestinian world, and that created a problem. One of the reasons for the failure is that after 1977, the government of Israel changes, the conservative party, the Likud, takes over, and the Likud allows thousands and hundreds of thousands of Israelis, many of them Orthodox, to move into the West Bank. So now the territory that they want to restore or rescue is what? Now being increasingly occupied by Jews and by Israelis. And one of the failures, the betrayal. There was a man called Anwar Sadat. In 1977, 78, 79, he did the unthinkable. He flew to Jerusalem and made peace with Israel. So Israel now has made peace with the Arab power that is the biggest and most powerful. And so she has reduced motivation to make concessions to the Palestinians. I mean, she can make peace with other Arab nations now without having to deal with the Palestinians. And the last, obviously, was in 1982, the Israeli army invades Lebanon. What had happened was Arafat establishes his base in Jordan. The king of Jordan can't allow Arafat to be there because the majority of the people in Jordan are Palestinian refugees. The presence of a Palestinian army will mean that Arafat can overthrow the king and take over Jordan and make it part of Palestine. So in 1969 and 70, he's driven out of Jordan. He has to find another base, so he moves his base from Jordan to Lebanon. There he sets up the army, and now raids occur on northern Israel. The Israelis find it intolerable. Menachem Begin and Arik Sharon now decide to invade Lebanon to drive the PLO from Lebanon. Now that war turned out to be a disaster for the Israelis in one respect. I mean, the Begin government was discredited, and the Israelis were forced to withdraw. But it was a success from another point of view. They drove the PLO and Arafat out of Lebanon. In fact, he ends up with his headquarters where? in Tunisia. I mean, he has to move all the way over here to find an Arab country that will give him what? A headquarters. Miles and miles away from the front. Well, by 1987, it looks as though the Palestinian cause is having a great deal of trouble, and then somebody comes up with another idea. It's an idea that works. Worked in Detroit. What happened in Detroit was that the people who felt oppressed rose up in a rebellion. Some of you may remember it. First one that I remember was 1943. The second one was 1967, and in fact, those two rebellions forced us. I mean, one of the ways to respond was to flee, but it forced us to what? I mean, you all of a sudden you had to deal with the reality. Well, that's called the Intifada. That was a change of strategy. It was an act of desperation. But in 1987, instead of an army from outside invading, the people inside of Israel, and the occupied territories in particular, rose up in a rebellion. Throwing stones, creating barriers, and all of a sudden, the Israelis are overwhelmed not by a war outside, they're overwhelmed by the what? The street riots, by the war inside, and it doesn't stop. What started as an act of desperation turns out to be the most successful strategy of the Palestinians. And it most likely started spontaneously and then was picked up. Now, the Intifada coincided with another event. And that was the fall of the Soviet Union, which should have been a triumph for the Israelis. But in the end, it did the opposite. Once the Soviet Union fell, or was falling, then the Americans no longer needed Israel as much as a bulwark against the Soviet Union in the Middle East. And now their focus is on maintaining access to their resources in the Middle East, namely oil. For that, they need the cooperation of Arabs. They can't get the cooperation of the fanatic anti-American Arabs, but there are moderate Arabs. The only way to get the support of moderate Arabs is somehow or other to stop this intifada. Oh. So already we hear from the White House sounds. The Israelis are now told, do something about this. So strangely enough, what appeared initially to be an Israeli victory turns out to be a situation in which the Israelis are forced to compromise. What started out as an act of Palestinian desperation turns out, by the fall of communism, to be an opportunity for the Palestinians to come back. Now, Arafat during this whole thing makes one terrible mistake. What replaces the Soviet Union now as the enemy is a madman still living called Saddam Hussein, who then proceeds to annex oil resources the Americans cannot allow to fall into the hands of Saddam Hussein. So what follows is the Gulf War. In the Gulf War, the United States gets Arab allies, Egypt, even Syria. But in that war, Arafat foolishly, big mistake, chooses Saddam Hussein. And many Israelis are saying, his goose is cooked. Fini. They'll fry him in Washington. But that didn't happen. In fact, the American long-run policy now in the Middle East is very clear. We wish to find moderate Arabs and moderate Muslim rulers to help us maintain peace, law and order, and our resources in that area. So in the end, despite the boo-boo, the American pressure on the Israelis did not stop. And that was all reinforced by something happening in Israel. It's called the arrival of prosperity. It's the arrival of the consumer culture. And now, all over Israel, the attitude of many, many people was, it happened in America. I mean, it happened during the Vietnam War. It was the height of prosperity. In the end, we'd rather what? Enjoy life than fight. And so now in Israel are all these voices, let's make peace, let's make peace, let's make peace, let's make... They're exhausted after all this war. So now the Israelis finally elect a person in 1992 to public office. His name is Yitzhak Rabin. And the stage is now set. The stage is now set, and the peace process begins. And the peace process, well, 1993 they shook hands. 1994 Jordan joined the whole thing. Well, the peace process says, well, we'll recognize that a Palestinian nation exists. Oh. And we'll give them most of the West Bank and Gaza. And we'll allow maybe, a Palestinian state to emerge. And we'll allow presently a Palestinian government to emerge called the Palestine National Authority. And we'll allow them to have police. And we'll allow other nations to recognize them without our protest. Oh. And then in 1994, the Israelis pull out of Gaza. By the way, only somebody who was suicidal would hang on to Gaza. And then in 1995, they pulled out of most of the major cities in the West Bank. And by 1997, they completed that. So by 1997, most of the Palestinian population in the occupied territories is now under the what? The Palestine National Authority. That doesn't mean the problems go away. The Palestinians have fundamentalist fanatics who are opposed to the agreement. Arafat is a dictatorial and corrupt ruler. The territories of the Palestinians are little donut holes in the West Bank. And the Israelis are always changing their mind, and they change their mind in particular when terrorism occurs. But the main thing is, now that we've agreed that there should be Palestine, what are its boundaries? Ooh. And that's where we are now. Got it? The agreement is supposed to be completed by the end of May, ready to be proclaimed in September. If it succeeds, there will arise in a formal sense a state called, an independent state, for the first time called Palestine, which will be recognized by the Palestinians and almost all the nations of the world. But will it include all of the West Bank? Will it include part of Jerusalem? Oh. So right in the middle, it's May. So let me just conclude with certain realities. Israelis and Palestinians overwhelmingly distrust each other. Got it? 2, the Palestinians are overwhelmingly disillusioned because they imagined in 1993 that the peace process would guarantee them in a fairly short time possession of the West Bank and Gaza, and they what? They don't have it. The third reality is that now Israel has a new prime minister. His name is Barak. And he has goofed in terms of trying to make peace with Syria. He thought he could avoid finalizing the Palestinian thing by doing a big thing with Syria, and that what? failed. So now his government's future depends on making peace with the Palestinians. And now the only way that can happen is through compromise. My prediction is a Palestinian state will emerge, maybe in this year. Certainly in September, it most likely will be proclaimed by the Palestinians as an independent state. But it will certainly include all of Gaza, they got it. But it won't include all of the West Bank, because there are certain areas of the West Bank now the Israelis are not prepared to give up, and the only way the Palestinians will ever get their state is what? To compromise. The compromise the Israelis will have to make is they're going to have to allow the Palestinians to have a capital on the edge of Jerusalem that they call Jerusalem. You understand? Very simple. I call Ferndale Detroit. It's all right. What difference does it make? Now, for many Israelis, that's going to be a difficult thing. The reality is that right now there's no alternative to Yasser Arafat, although he seems to be ailing. He seems to be in control. One of the realities is that after Palestine becomes independent, it's a non-viable state. Do you know how small it is? I mean, you're talking about something that is under 3,000 square miles. And now there are thousands and hundreds of thousands of refugees who want to come back. I mean, to what? Where? The Palestinian economy since 1967 has been totally integrated into the Israeli economy. And now there are going to be all the tensions about removing settlers from certain settlements, allowing a certain percentage, not very many, refugees to return. Already in Israel, the sign of the change is the Supreme Court in Israel and Israeli public opinion is now prepared to acknowledge the rights of Palestinian Arabs living in Israel to equal treatment. I don't know whether there have been two decisions recently by the Israeli Supreme Court. One in which members of a Jewish community wanted to refuse entry on the part of a Palestinian Arab to reside in it. And the Supreme Court says that's unacceptable. An Israeli citizen may live what? Anywhere you want. And also a decision that relates to the benefits that Arab Israelis are entitled to in terms of education and health. So this is the beginning of the change. So now let me just conclude by saying, for the last 100 years, the lives of Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs have been entwined, right? In a mixed neighborhood. Right? They've never been able to get rid of the mixed neighborhood. And so I do want to say something about the future. I don't think it will be possible to totally separate the two. In the end, if a state called Palestine is established, in the end, the Israelis and the Palestinians sharing this very small territory are going to have what? They're going to have all these connections. And will that be bad? Well, if you are a fanatic nationalist on either side, it will what? Be bad. But in the end, and I started with it and I want to conclude with it, in the end, the world is just one huge mixed neighborhood. And in the end, the only way that both Israel and Palestine will survive is they will have to establish some way of living in that mixed neighborhood whereby Israelis will be able freely to cross over into Palestine to do their business. Palestinians will be able to cross over into Israel to do their business and find employment. It will take a while for it to be there, but in the end, there's no alternative. A mixed neighborhood is a mixed neighborhood. Got the message? Thank you very, very much.